Your soulmate had a private meeting about you. What was said may surprise you. Something happened behind a closed door that your soulmate never expected you to discover. The room was quiet. A phone rested face down on the table. 3 people sat across from each other, and for several seconds, nobody spoke. Then your name came up. Not casually. Not in passing. Someone had brought you into the conversation for a reason. And the expression on your soulmate's face changed the moment they heard what was said. There was a hesitation before the first question. Are you sure about them? Your soulmate didn't answer immediately. They looked toward the window, took a slow breath, and seemed to replay months of memories in their mind. The late-night conversations. The moments when you stayed even when leaving would have been easier. The small things you did that you probably thought nobody noticed. Then someone at the table said something that made the entire atmosphere shift. I don't think you realize how much this person has affected your life. Your soulmate lowered their eyes. Because suddenly, this wasn't a conversation about whether they cared about you. It was about whether they were finally ready to admit how deeply they cared. But there was another reason this private meeting happened, and this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Someone close to your soulmate had noticed a change in them lately. They were quieter when your name was mentioned, more thoughtful after seeing something connected to you, and strangely protective whenever someone misunderstood your intentions. The meeting wasn't arranged to criticize you. It was arranged because someone wanted answers. They wanted to know what your soulmate truly planned to do about the connection between you. And when that question was finally asked directly, your soulmate gave an answer that nobody at the table expected. They said, I'm not confused about how I feel anymore. I'm just trying to figure out how to say it without ruining everything. And that sentence opened a door to a truth they had been keeping hidden even from themselves. The sentence hung in the room longer than anyone expected. No one rushed to answer. Your soulmate simply stared at the table, as if saying those words aloud had made everything more real. Then the person sitting across from them leaned forward and asked the question that had been waiting underneath the entire conversation, then why haven't you told them? Your soulmate gave a faint smile, but it wasn't a happy one. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know they've been caught avoiding the truth. Because, they finally said, once I tell them, I can't pretend this is just a passing feeling anymore. And suddenly, the meeting became less about you and more about a decision they had been quietly approaching for a long time. Someone reminded them of all the moments when you had shown patience without demanding anything in return. Another person mentioned how different your soulmate seemed whenever you were around. They weren't the same person. They were softer. More attentive. More willing to think about tomorrow instead of only surviving today. Then came the detail that made your soulmate completely silent. Someone at the table had noticed something they hadn't realized anyone was watching. They had seen your soulmate look at an old message from you, read it twice, and then put the phone away without replying. Why didn't you answer? The person asked. Your soulmate looked down. Because I didn't know how to answer honestly. That response revealed something important. The silence between you wasn't necessarily emptiness. It had been filled with thoughts they didn't know how to organize. They had been wondering whether you still believed in the connection, whether you had already moved on emotionally, and whether approaching you now would feel too late. But then someone asked a completely different question: what do you actually want from them? Your soulmate paused. This time, there was no nervous smile. No hesitation. They simply said, I want something real. I just want to know if they still want it too. And that was the moment the meeting changed direction. The person across from them leaned back and said, then stop trying to guess what they're thinking. If this matters to you, give them a reason to believe you're serious. Your soulmate looked toward the door, almost as if they could picture you standing on the other side. Their expression softened. They began talking about a conversation they had been imagining, not some dramatic confession, but a quiet moment where they could finally explain what had been happening inside them. They wanted to tell you why certain things had happened. Why they pulled back at certain moments. Why they sometimes seemed distant even when their feelings were anything but distant. And then came the part they had never admitted before. They were afraid that by waiting too long, they might lose the opportunity to tell you what you truly meant to them. If this story is already making you wonder what was said next, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy stories about unexpected emotional turns, you're welcome to stay connected. Because the next question in that room wasn't about their feelings anymore. It was about what they were finally prepared to do about them. The question landed softly, but it changed the entire atmosphere. So what are you going to do now? For the first time that evening, your soulmate didn't look away. They sat back, folded their hands, and seemed to make a decision in real time. There was no dramatic announcement. No sudden confession. Just a quiet certainty settling across their face. They said they didn't want to keep analyzing every message, every pause, every accidental encounter. They wanted to know where they stood with you. One person at the table asked, and if they don't feel the same way anymore? Your soulmate took a breath. Then I'll respect that, they answered. But I'd rather hear the truth from them than spend another year imagining it. That sentence revealed something important about the meeting. This wasn't about controlling the outcome. It was about finally having the courage to seek clarity. And somewhere inside that room, your soulmate seemed to realize that sometimes the greatest risk isn't hearing an answer you don't expect. It's never asking the question at all. Then someone placed a phone on the table. There was a message from you. Nothing dramatic. Just a few words. Yet your soulmate stared at it as though those words carried an entire history between you. You still have this? Someone asked. They nodded. I've read it more times than I should admit. The room became quiet again. Your soulmate explained that the message reminded them of something they had forgotten. You had never demanded perfection from them. You had simply wanted honesty. That realization seemed to hit differently. They began describing moments when they had almost reached out, only to stop themselves at the last second. Once, they had typed an entire message and deleted it. Another time, they had opened your profile, stared at the screen, and closed it without saying anything. Not because they didn't care, but because they were afraid that one wrong sentence could change everything. The person across the table listened carefully before saying, maybe they don't need the perfect words. Maybe they just need the real ones. Your soulmate looked up. And something in their expression changed. The hesitation was still there, but it no longer seemed stronger than the desire to be honest. They began speaking more openly than they had all evening. They admitted that your presence had made them reconsider what they actually wanted from a relationship. They said you had challenged them without trying to change them, and that being understood by someone like you had become something they valued more than they realized. But then came the revelation nobody at that table expected. Someone asked whether they were planning to tell you everything they had discussed that night. Your soulmate smiled quietly and said, "Not everything." A pause. "But I'm going to tell them enough." The room fell silent again. Because now there was a plan forming, and it involved a conversation with you that could finally bring an answer to the question neither of you had been able to ask directly. And there was one particular thing your soulmate planned to say first. Something they had rehearsed privately more than once, but had never been brave enough to speak aloud. The words had been rehearsed in your soulmate's mind so many times that they almost sounded familiar. Yet sitting there in that quiet room, saying them aloud still felt impossible. Someone noticed the hesitation and asked, "What would you say if they were sitting here right now?" Your soulmate looked down for a moment, then slowly lifted their eyes. "I'd tell them I never stopped caring." The room went still. They continued, explaining that there had been moments when silence looked like indifference from the outside, but inside, it had been anything but simple. They had questioned their timing, their choices, and even their ability to express what they felt. But one thing had remained consistent: whenever they imagined their future, your presence somehow found its way into the picture. Not because they had planned it. Because the connection had become impossible to dismiss. Then the conversation took an even more personal turn. Someone asked what they believed you misunderstood about them. Your soulmate answered almost immediately. "I think they believe I don't notice the little things." They began mentioning details you may have completely forgotten. A conversation where you listened longer than necessary. A moment when you encouraged them without expecting anything back. A simple gesture that seemed ordinary to you but stayed in their memory. They remembered your expressions, your patience, even the way you changed the subject when you sensed they were uncomfortable. They probably think those things disappeared into the past, your soulmate said. They didn't. That was the part that surprised everyone. The private meeting had started as a conversation about you, but it had slowly become an admission of how deeply your presence had influenced their decisions. Then someone asked, if they knew all of this, what do you think they would say? Your soulmate smiled. I honestly don't know. And that's what scares me. But instead of allowing that fear to end the conversation, someone offered a different perspective. Maybe you don't need to predict their response. Maybe you just need to give them the truth. Your soulmate sat quietly with those words. Then they reached for their phone. Their thumb hovered over your name. For several seconds, nothing happened. You could almost feel the weight of that moment, the distance between thinking about reaching out and actually doing it. Then the phone screen went dark. They placed it back on the table. Not because they had changed their mind, but because they had decided they wanted the conversation to happen differently. Face to face. No carefully edited message. No room to misunderstand a sentence. They wanted you to see their expression when they finally said what they had been holding back. And before the meeting ended, one final question was asked. What is the one thing you want them to understand? Your soulmate looked toward the window and answered quietly, that I'm not coming back because I'm lonely. I'm coming back because I finally understand what I had. If you've ever waited for someone to find the courage to say what they truly mean, you know why that sentence matters. But the private meeting wasn't finished yet. There was still one last piece of information on the table, something about the timing of your next conversation that your soulmate hadn't even considered until that moment. The room had already begun to settle when someone glanced at the clock and said, almost casually, "Then why wait?" Your soulmate looked at the time, and for a moment, the confidence they had built seemed to disappear. They knew what they wanted to say, but knowing and doing were two different things. Someone reminded them that the perfect moment rarely announces itself. Sometimes, it arrives disguised as an ordinary afternoon, an unexpected message, or a simple invitation to talk. Your soulmate listened without interrupting. Then they asked the question that had quietly been sitting beneath everything else. What if they think I'm only saying this because I'm afraid of losing them? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, someone said, then show them through consistency. Don't try to convince them in one night. Let your actions make the explanation. Your soulmate nodded slowly. That seemed to settle something inside them. The meeting wasn't about creating a dramatic moment anymore. It was about beginning something honest. Then another person brought up something your soulmate hadn't expected. They reminded them of the first time you met and asked what they remembered most. Your soulmate smiled almost instantly. They described the setting, the conversation, even a tiny detail about you that most people would have forgotten. It was obvious from their expression that the memory had never really left. I didn't know then, they admitted, how important that moment would become. That confession changed the mood completely. Suddenly, everyone understood that this wasn't a recent feeling created by loneliness or nostalgia. Something had been growing quietly through ordinary moments. The little conversations. The comfortable silences. The way you could make them laugh when they were carrying a difficult day. And then came a question that made your soulmate pause again. Do you think they know? They looked toward the phone and whispered, maybe not. I've been too good at hiding it. That sentence revealed the heart of the entire situation. You may have been looking at their silence and seeing uncertainty, while they had been experiencing something completely different, an emotional struggle between what they felt and what they were brave enough to reveal. Before the meeting ended, the person who had been listening most carefully leaned forward one final time. Then don't make them decode you anymore. Your soulmate looked up. What do you mean? The answer was simple. If you want them in your life, let them know. If you miss them, say it. If you regret something, explain it. And if you see a future with them, stop speaking as though they're already gone. Those words seemed to land deeper than anything else that night. Your soulmate took out their phone again. This time, they didn't hesitate. They opened your conversation, stared at the empty message box, and began typing. One sentence appeared. Then another. They stopped, read it twice, and smiled faintly. Whatever they were writing wasn't a casual check-in. It was the beginning of the conversation they had been avoiding. And just before they pressed send, they noticed one detail that made them stop completely, something connected to you that changed what they planned to say next. The message on the screen was only a few lines long, but your soulmate read it again and again. Then their eyes moved to something beside your name. A detail from an older conversation that suddenly made the entire evening feel connected. They remembered a promise you had once made, not a dramatic promise, but a simple one, that if either of you ever needed an honest conversation, you wouldn't pretend everything was fine just to avoid discomfort. Your soulmate leaned back and whispered, "They actually gave me a way to be honest." The person beside them smiled. "Then use it." Your soulmate looked at the message one final time before deleting half of what they had written. They weren't going to send an emotional speech. They wanted something simpler. Something real. Something that sounded like them. So they typed 3 words, "Can we talk?" And this time, they pressed send. For several seconds, nobody in the room said anything. Your soulmate placed the phone on the table, but their eyes kept drifting toward it. They weren't waiting for a perfect response. They were waiting for any response. Then the screen lit up. Your soulmate froze. The message wasn't long, but the expression on their face changed as they read it. Someone asked, "What did they say?" Your soulmate smiled before answering. "They said yes." That tiny word carried more weight than anyone expected. The conversation they had imagined for so long was suddenly no longer imaginary. It was actually coming. But there was another layer to this. Your soulmate didn't want to walk into that conversation pretending the private meeting had never happened. They had realized something important: if they were going to rebuild trust, they had to stop hiding behind carefully chosen words. They needed to explain what they had been thinking, what they had been afraid of, and why your connection still mattered to them. And then someone asked the question that brought everything back to you: what if they ask what you said about them tonight? Your soulmate went quiet. For the first time, there was a nervous laugh. "I guess I'll have to tell them." The person across the table raised an eyebrow. "Everything?" Your soulmate shook their head. "Not every detail. But the truth." They looked at the phone again, and this time there was something different in their expression. Relief. Not because everything was solved, but because the uncertainty had finally started moving toward an answer. The private meeting had begun with your name being spoken behind a closed door. It was ending with your soulmate preparing to bring the conversation directly to you. And there was one thing they had decided they would not leave unsaid when you finally met, the one sentence that could explain why they had stayed silent for so long. If you heard those words from them, you might finally understand that the silence was never the whole story. The next morning arrived differently for your soulmate. Nothing outside had changed, yet everything inside felt strangely lighter. The phone sat beside them, carrying the unanswered possibility of a conversation that could change the direction of the connection. They opened your chat once more, but this time they didn't type anything. They simply looked at the last exchange and remembered the private meeting. The questions. The hesitation. The moment they finally admitted what they wanted. Then something unexpected happened. They realized they weren't afraid of telling you the truth anymore. They were afraid of continuing to live without telling you. That distinction mattered. It meant the conversation ahead wasn't about winning you back, proving something, or forcing an outcome. It was about finally allowing you to see the part of them they had kept carefully hidden. Later, when your soulmate met with the same person from the meeting, the conversation continued in a completely different tone. "Are you still going to tell them?" they asked. Your soulmate nodded. "Yes. Even if it's uncomfortable?" Another nod. "Especially then." They explained that they had spent too much time trying to protect the connection from difficult conversations, only to create more distance by avoiding them. They didn't want that anymore. They wanted you to know that the private meeting wasn't held because there was something wrong with you. Quite the opposite. Your name had come up because you mattered enough for them to seriously examine what they were feeling. They had talked about your character, your patience, your impact, and the future they could imagine if both of you were willing to be whole.